Chapter 45, Back from the Dead. Take another look. Had he heard a voice? Or had the words just emerged from his mind? Take a closer look. There it was again, and still he couldn't tell whether it was a voice speaking to him from outside or words sounding in his head. What did it mean? Take a closer look at what? At the fissure blocking his route? At possible ways to bridge it? Hesitantly, Ari stood up and looked around. Nothing had changed. Go closer, to the very edge. Impelled by that command, he cautiously approached the brink once again and peered down into the void, then searched either side of that awesome chasm. The roar of the river below was nerve-shattering. Still, he saw nothing that he hadn't seen before, nothing to give him any hope. Wait! Was that a faint trail, just barely visible in a sandy stretch amidst the gravel and rocks at the base of the sheer bluff rising above him? Impossible! Climbing over the boulders to get a closer look, he noticed that the wall of rock did not go all the way to the edge of the chasm. There was a space about 18 inches wide that seemed to curve around the rampart and out onto the very rim of the fissure. That was where the trail, if that's what it was, seemed to lead. Did he dare to follow it? Go to the edge. It was a command to be obeyed. Pressing up against the sheer face of rock, he inched his way carefully around the base of the cliff onto a narrow ledge rimming the slippery brink of the abyss. That was when he saw it, no more than a dozen steps away, hidden back in a recess. A natural rock bridge that couldn't be seen from any other place. As he looked at it in grateful astonishment, he noticed something peculiar about its formation. It looked for all the world like a giant figure, knees resting on this side, torso bending over to bridge the chasm, and extended hands and bowed head just touching the other side. Nicole's dream. As if in a trance, Ari climbed up onto the strange formation and cautiously made his precarious way across it. Jumping down on the other side with a sob of relief, he hurried toward the light. A few more minutes of rugged climbing brought him to the exit, where he pulled himself up through the small opening and found himself at last outside. He was standing on a steep rocky slope looking down on a wooded valley of tall pines and scattered redwoods. Thank you, Lord! Thank you, Lord! There was no trail outside leading away from the small fissure in the rocky mountainside. Apparently, the cavern, or at least this end of it, had laid undiscovered throughout its geological history. He would have to pick his own path across the boulders. The sun had already fallen beyond the higher reaches of the coastal range behind him. That would be to the west. Palo Alto and the closest habitation must be straight ahead and below. Weak from pain as well as hunger and thirst, Ari made his way as rapidly as he could down the hill toward the valley that lay before him. Far above him, a passenger jet passed overhead. Hearing the sound, he paused to look up. The plane's vapor trail was turning orange in the diffused rays of sun that must be coming from very low on the horizon. He had perhaps another 2 hours of adequate light. Hurrying on, Ari had gone about half a mile when he came to a miniature stream, bounding its way down the mountainside. From a shallow pool beneath a small waterfall, he drank with convulsive gulps. Then, taking off his coat, he splashed water over his face and neck and cleaned the cuts and abrasions on his hands and arms. He pulled off the tie he still wore, then threw the frayed and filthy rag into the brush. He looked worse than a tramp. Dipping a handkerchief in the water and wringing it out, he used the damp cloth to wipe half-heartedly at the worst of the mud that was caked onto his torn pants and jacket. The expensive suit the Mossad had provided for his attendance at the World Congress. He shuddered at the memory. Continuing to angle down across the slope, in and out of ravines, wondering how far he'd have to go, how far he could go, Ari suddenly heard what sounded like a car engine in the distance. Thank God! Another 100 yards, and he heard a similar noise, this time much louder. It sounded like a truck engine laboring up a steep grade. Staggering on eagerly in the direction of the sound, He came out of the trees into a small clearing on the brow of a hill. There it was, a highway, not more than 200 yards below him, discernible here and there where it wound its way through the trees. Thank you, Lord. After another 10 minutes of beating a laborious path through the thick underbrush and fallen logs, he climbed up a steep embankment and stood upon the asphalt at last. Which way? Surely Palo Alto would have to be downhill, as he had already surmised. He stationed himself on that side of the road and waited. In less than a minute, a logging truck came inching down the grade, gears whining. Ari waved and yelled, but the driver went right on. Too heavy a rig to stop. Then came a passenger car, and almost immediately behind it another. The drivers accelerated when he tried to flag them down. Of course, who would risk picking up a disreputable-looking bum like him? Desperately, Ari considered his options. How could he get someone to stop? Just then, an old relic of a pickup truck, battered and rusted, came wheezing and backfiring down the steep grade. Ari waved and yelled. With an ear-splitting screech of worn-out brakes, the vehicle lurched to a halt. "Hey, buddy, what's your problem?" came the genial query from the driver, a bronzed man of about 50 wearing faded overalls. His long, tangled hair and bushy beard made him look like a hippie left over from the 60s. A strong hand reached out and removed a frayed cord that secured the door. The hand froze. "Say, you been in a hurricane or something? Where you going, anyway?" "Palo Alto. Is this the right way?" asked Ari hopefully. He had to yell to make himself heard above the blaring radio. "Sure is, man. That's where I'm a-goin'. Say, where'd you pick up that foreign accent?" "Born in Germany. Lived most of my life in France." "Sounds like it. Well, get yourself in, man, before this baby stalls." Gratefully, Ari climbed in. He sensed momentarily the irony of his situation. Who but this anachronism from a past give peace a chance era would dare to pick up a derelict like him? "Hey, man, what's happened to you? It ain't rained for weeks round here. Where'd you find the mud?" "I must look horrible," returned Ari apologetically. "I got lost. Fell over a cliff into a river." "Ain't no rivers in these parts. You must have come a long ways. Where's your car?" "I meant a creek. I'm so tired I can hardly think." "Forget the car. I just need to get to Palo Alto." "Don't sweat it, man. I'll take you right to your house." "I don't live there. I'm staying at a hotel." "Yeah? Which one?" "The Hilton." "Whew, that's not my neighborhood, but I know right where it's at. Now you just settle back and catch some winks. You look like you need it. I'll wake you up when we get there." As the driver released the brake and resumed his journey down the mountain, the throbbing rock music gave way to a news bulletin. "Here's another update on that disaster in the foothills of the coastal range above Palo Alto. The dead and missing now stand at 298, most of them delegates from foreign countries. No cause has yet been established for the explosion that destroyed the main building and was witnessed from just outside the property by more than 200 media representatives. The government refuses to identify the kind of work that was being done there. It is rumored to have been a top-secret psychic research center. Officials at Stanford University deny any connection to their institution. There are 2 known survivors, Antonio Del Sasso, a Jesuit priest, and Carla Bertelli, a journalist specializing in parapsychology. Both were apparently employed at the destroyed installation, though in what capacity is not known. Del Sasso is in the hospital, recovering from smoke inhalation and internal injuries, while Ms. Bertelli was apparently unharmed. Neither survivor, however, has been available for comment. "Carla's safe. What happened to Korev? And Del Sasso, the evil one, what will he do now? Does he know I survived? I've got to get my clothes, get cleaned up, get back to Israel." The driver reached over and turned off the radio. "Worst disaster ever happened round here," he said. "Ain't been nothing else on the news all day. What do you think?" He noticed that his passenger was already fast asleep. The next thing Ari knew, someone was shaking him back to consciousness. He awakened with a start, wondering where he was, then remembered. The cavern, the mountain. The pickup truck. You must have been plenty tired, dropped off and been snoring all the way down here. Well, there's the Hilton, across the street. I figured, this ain't exactly a limo. Thank you, said Ari, still groggy and so stiff he could hardly move. Painfully, he reached into his pocket. Here, let me... No way, man, you don't owe me nothing. Ari climbed out of the truck, slammed the door, and waved as the pickup chugged off down the street. There was no way to avoid the startled glances and whispered comments as Ari limped across the crowded lobby. At the registration counter, he hastened to get out his explanation before the startled clerk, mouth hanging open in shock, could object to his presence. I've had an unfortunate accident. Been lost in the woods. Nearly killed myself, but I'm okay. I've got a room here. Someone else checked me in. Name's Thalberg. Ari Thalberg. The clerk, a meticulously groomed young man in his 20s, punched Ari's name into the computer and after a moment looked up at him in shock. You were with that delegation at the Congress. You're supposed to be dead. I just got out of the mountains and heard the news. Terrible. I was so embarrassed that I got lost and missed the meeting. But now, what luck. I need to get into my room. They've put your baggage in storage, but I could have the bellman get it. Your room is still available. The clerk hesitated. They think you're dead, Shouldn't we notify the police? Look, said Ari, leaning over the counter and lowering his voice to his most confidential tone. This is so embarrassing. Let me tell them, in my own words, after I get cleaned up, okay? I don't want anyone to see me like this. The clerk nodded understandingly. Here's your key, room 342. Why not take the fire stairs just over there? I'll have your baggage brought right up. After showering and wolfing down a huge meal delivered to his room, Ari collapsed into the bed. He awakened late the next morning with the sun streaming through the sliding glass door leading out onto the balcony. After shaving and eating breakfast in his room, he called one of a half-dozen memorized numbers. Hello, said a deep male voice after several rings. I have a valuable export for Syria, said Ari, in the lobby of the Hilton. That's not possible, came the startled reply. The agent obviously thought that Ari was dead and that he was being contacted by an imposter. There was no code to cover this situation. Look, I'm alive, said Ari, and I really need help. Fast. We'll take the product in about 15 minutes. Ari packed his bags and went down to the lobby. He had no intention of checking out. Let them think he was still there. He sat in a chair as far from the registration desk as possible and waited. Whoever was meeting him knew what he looked like, though he had no way of visually recognizing any of the Mossad connections. In about 10 minutes, 2 men entered the lobby and sat down near Ari. Casually, they glanced around the room, lit cigarettes, and looked bored. Finally, the taller of the two shifted nervously in his chair and said to his companion in a low voice, My God, I don't believe it. It's the package. I've got to get back to Israel fast, said Ari softly. The second man stood up. I'll bring the car around. Give me 2 minutes. He turned and walked back out the main entrance. Safely in the car and on his way to San Francisco's International Airport, Ari was reluctant to explain what had happened. I've got tons to report, but I don't know the classification on this information. It's that incredible, he told the 2 agents. I'm only going to give it to my Katza back in Israel. That's David Cawley. Let him know that I'm coming. We'll do that, said the taller man who had introduced himself as Sam and his companion as Mike, obviously not their real names. Sam looked at his watch. We're in good time. You'll easily make the next El Al flight. You can at least tell us how you survived, said Mike, who was driving, and where you've been all this time. You wouldn't believe what happened if I told you, replied Ari. I find it difficult to believe it myself. The floor literally opened up, and the entire press corps was dropped deep into some underground cavern. I don't think any of the others survived. It was a miracle that I'm still alive, and that I managed to find my way out in the late afternoon of the next day. So you weren't in the auditorium when the actual explosion took place? Asked Sam. I don't know anything about an explosion, though I saw pictures of it on the news last night. I was gone by then, and I doubt that anyone inside was still alive when it happened. They'd already been killed by other means. I witnessed that. The explosion, I suspect, was to cover up what had happened and to destroy all evidence. 17 hours later, David met Ari at Tel Aviv's Lod airport and eased him quickly through customs. To Ari's joyful surprise, when they came out into the waiting area, there were Yaakov and Miriam. Their smiles of relief and pleasure were like a healing balm to Ari's spirit. David had told the good news to Yaakov, who had called Miriam. The three of them had come together in David's car. "The Post announced that you were dead," exclaimed Miriam, throwing her arms around Ari. "I didn't believe it." She held him at arm's length, looking into his eyes searchingly. "You have something wonderful to tell me. I know it. Oh, Ari, darling." Ari pulled her tightly to him. "Your prayers have been answered," he whispered as he held her tightly. Releasing Miriam, Ari embraced Yaakov, sobbing as he clung to the old man. "You were right, Yaakov. You were right. I'm sorry I gave you such a hard time." "I knew you'd come through," said Yaakov. "The Lord told me, just like he told Miriam." David had stood to one side, looking uncomfortable, but waiting patiently. Now he led them to his car. Yaakov sat beside him in the front, while Ari and Miriam sat in the back. For the moment, it seemed enough to just hold Miriam close to him. The explanation, the details, the recounting of the incredible spiritual journey that had found its culmination in the amazing events of the past few days would come in due time. But for this glorious few moments, he would give himself over to joy. "I'll hold off debriefing at the headquarters until tomorrow," said David. "Let you spend the night at the apartment, on the condition that you put everything on a tape recorder immediately. Everything. Yaakov will stay up with you until you're finished. Miriam, you'll have to keep out of it. Go to your cousins right away. Ari has to be able to think." Neither Miriam nor Ari heard a word David said. At that moment, Ari was asking her, "Will you marry me?" This time he was sure of the answer.